You are President James K. Polk. The year is 1846, and you have a decision to make. You have been trying to get the government of Mexico to sell the United States, California. California with its harbors at San Francisco, Monterey, San Diego. The Mexican government has refused. You want California. You'll take the territory between California and the Rocky Mountains and Texas. The United States has recently annexed Texas. Background quickly. Texas had been part of Mexico until 1836, when restive Americans in Texas staged a revolution against the Mexican government. They managed to win their independence of Mexico, although for the next 9 years, from 1836 to 1845, the Mexican government did not recognize the independence of Texas. The Mexican government still claimed that it controlled, that it owned Texas. In fact, the Mexican government sent the Mexican army twice into Texas to reassert Mexican control, but they could never make it stick. So Texas was in this no man's land between Mexico and the United States. The Texans declared a republic. This was the era of the Texas Republic, very, very important in Texas history, and it's something that proud Texans learn to remember about their country, about their state. It was at one time this independent republic, and it's one of those 6 flags that wave over Texas and Texas's amusement parks. Anyway, so Texas had been applying for admission to the United States, but it got blocked by anti-slavery elements in Congress who said, no, Texas is going to come in as a slave state, and it's so big it'll break up into a bunch of states, and we don't want Texas. But you, James Polk, had campaigned in 1844 on a platform of acquiring Texas, annexing Texas. And you won. You won on this platform. And in fact, even before you became President of the United States, even before you were inaugurated, Texas was annexed to the United States. Now, this was something that the Mexican government did not accept, and Mexico was on the verge of declaring war on the United States, although the Mexican government was in no position really to take on the United States unless it absolutely had to. You thought, now you're President Polk, you thought you would take advantage of Mexico's weakness in basically strong-arming Mexico into selling California to you, to the United States. You have had your eye on Pacific frontage for the United States for some time. In the campaign of 1844, you had also talked about the annexation of the Oregon country, what's now the state of Oregon and Washington, and actually then it included British Columbia as well. So you were looking to the Pacific. You were, James Polk, you're a Tennessean, and you had been thinking in Western terms. This is what Westerners did. And even in the 1840s, Tennesseans were considered Westerners. So you'd been looking to the West, and you had been all in favor of the annexation of Texas, and the annexation of Texas occurred. You had been all in favor of acquiring Oregon, and you were in the process of negotiating a deal with Britain about that. You wanted California. California would round out what you saw as an American Southwest. And the big attraction of California was that it had these wonderful harbors, because you're thinking that California is going to be good not simply for California, but for the access it provides to the Pacific. And the harbor at San Francisco, the harbor at San Diego, these two were fantastic. You could have merchant ships who would seek shelter there. If and when the United States had a Pacific Navy, the Navy could find shelter and bases there. So you, James K. Polk, are thinking this sort of long-term vision for the United States. And it has to have California. This is in your thinking. So you offer what you think is a perfectly fair price to Mexico for California. But the Mexican government is not even entertaining your offers. Mexico says, under no circumstances will we sell California. Now, if you're able to step out of yourself for a moment and consider this from the point of view of Mexico, yeah, their response, their negative response, makes a certain sense. From their perspective, A whole bunch of Americans poured into Texas, many of them illegally, and then grabbed Texas away from Mexico, and the United States, with some delay to be sure, accepted the stolen goods. So if you are the Mexican government, if you're the people of Mexico, you look on the United States of America as this land-hungry giant to your north. And you're not going to feed that lion unless you absolutely have to. So, in fact, it got to the point in Mexico, in Mexican politics, where for a Mexican government and a Mexican administration even to listen to any American offers of selling California would have been basically a death sentence for that Mexican administration. So Polk could not get any satisfaction. He couldn't get California. He made the argument, look, California is worth a lot more to the United States than it ever will be to Mexico. California is a long way from the populated regions of Mexico, and you've, Spain before you and now the government of Mexico, you've never made much of California, so, get rid of it. We'll give you some good ready money for it. Mexican government said no. So, President Polk, what do you do? Do you simply say, well, boy, I tried? You could point at some of your predecessors. Andrew Jackson had talked to Mexico about purchasing land, and he'd been foiled, and he'd basically accepted, okay, they don't want to sell, and that's that. But you consider yourself something of a protege of Andrew Jackson, and it was Andrew Jackson who helped you get the Democratic nomination in 1844, and so you're thinking, well, maybe I can even outdo Andrew Jackson. So, what are you going to do? He was willing to accept no for an answer, although he supported the Texans when they staged their revolt against Mexico. But what are you going to do? Are you just going to say, well, all right, Texas, you could claim victory for Texas, the victory in acquiring Texas, annexing Texas, you would campaign on it, and it happened. You could claim victories at Chernout. You're going to be able to claim victory for Oregon. Not quite as much of Oregon as you had hoped for, but what would become the states of Oregon and Washington. So that's a big deal. But in your thinking, as you look at a map of North America, you would see this big chunk that's in the wrong hands. You're thinking that the southern border of Texas ought to just continue roughly to the Pacific, and that part should be part of the United States. So what do? Well, what are your choices? If Mexico's not going to sell, and you really want it, well, basically, if Mexico doesn't want to sell, you either have to accept Mexico's no for an answer, and you're not going to get California, or if you want California, you're probably going to have to seize it. You're probably going to have to take it by force, because Mexico's not going to give it up willingly. So, is that what you do? These are your choices. You, dear students, are James Polk. What do? Well, I'll tell you what James Polk did. He huffed and puffed, and he threatened Mexico, and he said all sorts of nasty things about the Mexican government as to how it had broken its promises to the United States and had not paid its debts, and how it had insulted American honor and all this other stuff. And you went so far as to draft a message to Congress, a request for a declaration of war, thinking that somehow Mexico would do something that would give you an excuse for declaring war. But it looked as though even if Mexico didn't do it, you were thinking of declaring war anyway. You did something else. And that is you sent American troops to the border between American territory, newly American territory in Texas, and Mexico. You sent them to the strip of land between the Rio Nueces, the Nueces River in southern Texas, and the Rio Grande, the current border between Texas and Mexico. And you sent these troops there under General Zachary Taylor. You sent them there for the purpose of provoking a Mexican attack. You knew that the region between the Nueces and the Rio Grande was in dispute, that the Mexican government said that the traditional border between Mexico proper and Texas had always been the Nueces River. And so therefore the border now between American Texas and Mexico is the Nueces River, about 100 miles north of the Rio Grande. But you, President Polk, claim the Rio Grande as the boundary, and Texans had claimed the Rio Grande as a boundary, and you knew that this territory was in dispute. Now, if you had been of a mind to negotiate, if you had been a mind to be a diplomat about it, this thing could have been resolved. Because at this time, in 1846, there was precious little between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande worth bothering about, certainly not worth fighting about. But you, James Polk, were not in a diplomatic mind. You were not in a negotiating frame of mind. You, well, to put it not too bluntly, you wanted a war. And so the purpose of those troops in that border strip, the purpose was to provoke an attack by Mexican forces. Zachary Taylor marched his troops up and down, and they rode, cavalry and infantry, they rode back and forth, and they basically thumbed their noses at the Mexican forces, the Mexican troops, on the south side of the Rio Grande. Initially, Mexican troops refused to take Polk's and Taylor's bait. They refused to be drawn into a fight. But over a course of months, tensions grew until finally there was a skirmish. There was a skirmish, and it was on, well, what the United States called the American side of the river. It was in that strip that the Mexican government called the Mexican side of the Nueces. So Mexican troops were doing no more from their own point of view than defending Mexican territory against these invaders. The skirmish took place and several Americans were killed. Polk read the news from this disputed region, read the news from Texas, and he thought, finally, I've got my excuse for war. And so he went to Congress with a request for a declaration of war. He said, American blood has been shed on American soil. Polk knew something that would be proven true again and again in American history. If Americans are attacked by foreign troops, by foreign nationals, and especially if the attack takes place on American soil, this is automatically cause for a declaration of war. Now, even with all this, the vote for war in Congress was divided. And members of the opposite party was the Whigs party, Polk was a Democrat. Whigs were really suspicious about all this, but nonetheless, Polk got his war, and the war proceeded, and the United States wound up with California. So that's what James Polk did to resolve his dilemma. He wanted California, but Mexico wouldn't sell. That's what James Polk did. What would you have done?